Right, so as Phil said, today is part two of a two-parter. So if you weren't here last week, then I hope today will make some sense to you as a standalone, but you may want to catch up on YouTube or on podcast. Otherwise, you might feel that what I say this morning is a touch incomplete, and you would be right. We finished last week with a couple of challenges. So I'm tempted to ask for hands, but judging from the look of one or two of your faces as I said challenges, I won't. But a couple of people have said to me that they have actually done those, or at least kind of put commitments in place. You know, they've texted people and said, at some point, let's talk about our money and share our budgets and stuff. So that encourages me, and let it encourage you as well, that if now is the first time you've remembered about the challenges I left you last week, then it's not too late. Put that reminder in your phone. Do you make the time to really look at where your money goes and commit yourselves to sharing that with someone else? And if you weren't here last week and you're wondering why on earth I have asked you to do that, it's because last week we looked at how Jesus claims that what we do with our money is pretty much the most important factor that will determine the kind of people that we become. And Jesus seemed to say that money is the biggest threat to our commitment and service of God. It's the most potent alternative God that we would be tempted to bend our lives around. So we spoke about that last week, about this formative power of how we use our money, and then also explored how part of the challenge for us in doing anything about this is the way that our minds become so distorted in the area of money. We talked about how we tend to compare ourselves to those who are richer than us and feel poor. We tend to have a very skewed view of what we need, how we tend to assume that when we have more, we'll give more, despite all the research suggesting that that is not the case. And there was something else as well. I need to check my notes. Oh, I haven't even written it down. There was another one as well. But our money messes with our heads. And so it's very hard for us to... Jesus knew this. This is why he said this is so hard. It's so hard to see money clearly and to do the right thing with it, but it's really important. And we finished last week by just trying to think about why. Why is money such a powerful influence? And we talked about the promises that money seems to make, that money was going to give us security, that it's going to give us independence, that it's going to give us pleasure. And that although all of those things are a lie, there is just enough truth in them to make them seem plausible. And that truth is that material things are good. God created a good world. It's good to enjoy it. And that truth seems to lend a little bit of truth to these other lies that can then promise so much and fail to deliver. And when we finished last week, we finished by just naming the fundamental truth that we have to get hold of if we want to see money and our possessions correctly, and if we want to lean into the spiritual discipline of giving. And that truth is that we are not owners of our money and possessions, but we're stewards. And we're going to explore that more this morning. And we're also going to get some nuts and bolts. So towards the end of my sermon, we will talk about some of the practical stuff. But there's no point getting to the practical stuff unless we've soaked in some of the principles and the core claims that Jesus makes about money and how giving can shape us in a positive way. So that's the plan for this morning. So when we become Christians, we talk about that as a conversion, don't we? That maybe we weren't Christians and then we become Christians and we convert. Some of our beliefs change in that process. But actually to follow Jesus requires a conversion, not just of a few metaphysical beliefs, like there isn't a God, now there is, and Jesus is just a man and now he's divine. Actually, conversion requires the whole of our worldview and the whole of our lives to come into line with the truth. That is a Christian conversion. That's why our conversion, in some sense, lasts the entirety of our lives up to the resurrection. And so if we want to lean into following Jesus with our money, we need a conversion in the way that we see and deal with money in our lives. And the primary belief that needs to change is this, that rather than seeing our money and our possessions as belonging to me, that I am the owner, they're mine to do with as I will, we need a conversion to seeing the truth that all things belong to God. All things, including the money and possessions that are currently under your control. They are still belong to God, come from his hand, and we do not own them. We are given the responsibility of stewarding them in accordance with his will. So we're going to flesh that out now, but that is the conversion that needs to happen in us if we are going to be able to follow Jesus well with our money. And it's a similar principle, just by analogy, to the principle that underlines the belief that all human life is of value. So if human life is something that belongs to me, it's very tricky to actually spell out what holds on to the value of human life. But if life is something created and given by God, then it underwrites the value of life. So it's wrong for me to ever take life because it does not belong to me. It is given by God. And you might want to see that as an analogy. And so it means that when it comes to money, we are only ever owners in a secondary sense. The things that I own secondarily, they primarily belong to God. And that principle is fleshed out all over the Bible, but one of my favourite places where it's expressed is when King David wants to build a temple. And God says to him, no, you're not to build a temple, but what you can do is gather resources for the temple, and your son will build it. And David leads the whole people of Israel in gathering like material resources to build the temple, the wood, the metal, all of this sort of thing. And when it's all gathered together, all these free will offerings, David prays this. I think I've got the text on the screen. Is it there? There it is. Here we go. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. For all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. In your hand are power and might, and in your hand it is to make great and give strength to all. And now we thank you, O God, and praise your glorious name. But who am I and what is my people that we should be able thus to offer willingly? For all things come from you, and of your own have we given you. For we are strangers before you and sojourners as all our fathers were. Our days on the earth are like a shadow. There is no abiding. O Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for building you a house for your holy name comes from your hand and is all your own. David has understood this truth. He has understood this truth. All things come from you, and of your own we have given you. And the language that theologians have found most helpful through the centuries to describe this is the language of stewardship. It's not a word that we tend to use as often now as when the Bible was written, but it's a helpful word because it communicates a genuine responsibility and a level of control over resources, but not an ownership. We steward on behalf of the owner. And this is one of the things that it means to be made in the image of God. So even if you don't know much about Christianity, you may know that Christians claim that every human is made in God's image. And that means several things. But one of the things that means we can get in touch with if we think a little bit about ancient Near Eastern kings. So last week we had first century biology. Now we're going to have Assyrian kings, okay? I've got a picture, so it's not all bad. There you go. Look at that. I can't remember what his name is, but that's a sort of bog standard Assyrian king. And back in the ancient Near East, where the area of the world and the time where Genesis took its final form, you had massive empires, but no internet. So it was ruled by the king, but the king had the sort of fundamental ontological problem that he could only be in one place at a time. And therefore, he had to rule over this empire, not by being physically present, but by having himself represented all over the empire. And this happened in lots of different ways. So seals, wax seals, stamp of the king represents his will. But it also worked by statues, things like this. They literally put statues of the king all over the empire as an image of the king that represented his rule and authority in those parts. And importantly for this morning, the third factor was stewards. The king had little underlings, little minions who would rule different parts of his empire, but they would represent the authority of the king. And they don't own the bits they rule. They're answerable to the king for it, but they represented his power and authority. That is part of what Genesis is trying to tell us when it says we are made in the image of God. It's not just about us having rationality and the ability to have abstract thoughts, or us being relational, or us having a spiritual side. It may be those things as well, but in that world, part of what it's saying is humans are made to represent God to the rest of creation as his stewards. Does that make sense? So being a steward is what it is to be human. Part of being in the image of God is this vocation we all have as stewards. And that's the mindset shift we have to make. That's what I'm praying happens in all of us, more and more so. And if that's true, if this conversion can happen, then the key question about giving will change for us. And the key question is not out of mine, how much should I give to God, which is normally how we talk about it and think about it, but has to change. The key question is, out of all the resources that God has given me to steward, how much am I going to keep for myself? Yeah? Out of all the resources that God has given me to steward, how much am I going to spend on myself, and how much am I going to use for the wider purposes of God and his kingdom? One pastor once quipped, God employs you as a steward and then lets you set your own salary. Yeah? It's an interesting way to think about your income and your assets, isn't it? God has given you a job to steward them, but he's going to let you set how much you pay yourself. Another pastor quipped, when our income and our assets increase, we need to reflect on whether that's to increase our standard of living or increase our standard of giving. Yeah? You may have heard that one before. So that's the big conversion we need, but I do want to press a little bit beyond that. It feels like in some ways we could stop there. But I want to press a little bit beyond that because this is in the spiritual disciplines series, and we talked about how spiritual disciplines are ways that we meet with God. We encounter him and he changes us. And so I just want us to think together this morning about how is it that learning to give, learning to live this way with our money and possessions, how does that change us and shape us and who we become? I've got four points I'd like to make on this. We'll largely ground this in the book of 2 Corinthians. So the first way that practicing the spiritual discipline of giving changes us is it makes us more like Jesus. Let's read together 2 Corinthians chapter 8, where Paul writes to the church and he says, "But as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. And in this matter, I give my judgment. This benefits you. This benefits, to learn to give benefits you. If you read your Bible, God is a giving God. He gives existence and life to all creation. All things come from his hand. Every breath we take, in that sense, is a gift of the God who sustains his world. And then he gives himself through Jesus to redeem all that he's made. Jesus comes to give his life. He said, I've come not to be served, but to serve and give my life for the ransom of many. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Again and again, as we read through the Bible, we see that this is God's nature. He is so full of love in himself as Trinity that he overflows and gives by his very nature. And as we learn to do the same, we become like him. Second, as we increasingly recognize that all things belong to God, and we learn to give, we will also be shaped by this, but it will teach us to trust him. Faith, what does it mean to have faith in God? Does it just mean to believe he's there? Absolutely not. Faith is more like, it's a trust. It's not just believing someone's there, it's trusting them in practice with our lives. And as we learn to live generous lives, giving away, we will have to learn, as we do that, to trust God's provision for us. Because despite the false promises of money, it's not actually the amount you got in your saver or the security of your investments that is going to guarantee your future. It is following Jesus and finding that God commits himself to providing for our needs on the way. Let's read a bit more of Matthew 6 that we read a lot of last week. Therefore I tell you, are we there? Yeah. Do not be anxious about your life, says Jesus, what you'll eat, what you'll drink, nor about your body, what you'll put on. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to the span of his life? And why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Therefore do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and these things will be added to you. Let me be really clear at this point. We are not preaching a version of the prosperity gospel that normally goes along the lines of, you give lots of money to our church and God will make sure you become rich. That is a very widespread heresy that has done untold damage to people's lives and to the church, and it crops up all over the place. And where it crops up, pray it gets stamped out. That's not what we're preaching. What we're preaching is that what the Bible claims here, that as we follow Jesus with our money, God is attentive to our needs and we can trust him to provide for us. Okay? There are so many stories to tell at this point, aren't there? I have stories from my own life. I remember the year of mine and Jay's life where we were still in Nottingham, where we felt God call us for me to study, and it required leaving work. And in 1 year, you don't need to know, in 1 year, God provided £14,000 to us, unasked for, out of the blue, met our needs. I have never had a year like it before or since. It happened on the 1 year where we needed it. And but I'm not the only one with stories. You might like to. Is Rob Chapman here today? Rob, give us a wave. You might want to go and talk to Rob. Talk to Rob about the time where his business had nothing in the bank and he had nothing in the bank, and he has no idea quite how it happened. but the way that God saw him through those times. You might want to talk to Phil Cook about little brown envelopes, dropping through the door just at the weekend where that bill needed to be paid. You might want to talk to Deb, who spoke to me before the service, and she talked about how, as a young Christian, she gave in the way that she was taught, despite not having much money, and one way or the other, always just about somehow had enough. I don't know how many years of my life I've started where you look at the budget and it looks like you're going to end up here, and then somehow you don't. And you never quite work it all out. I'm sure many of you have these sort of stories. And the beautiful thing is that living these sort of stories teaches you to trust God in a way you can't learn unless you learn by doing it. It takes it out of the realm of theory. I have the opinion that God will care for my needs, but I don't actually know because I've never had to trust him. And it brings it into the reality of I know he's going to care for my needs because he did last year. Somehow it's always hard to trust him next year. Why is that? Why, when he's provided for me for however many years, why is it still hard next year? I guess it's hardness of heart and all of that sort of thing. But so there you go. Giving in this way shapes us because we learn to trust God in practice, in reality, that changes us on the inside. Third thing to say. When the whole balance of Scripture is taken into account, it seems clear to me that God does not intend us to live independent, self-sufficient lives. And this can be hard for us. Dare I say, particularly of a certain generation who may have grown up with the kind of pseudo-moral value of you can't count on anyone, you've got to do it for yourself. Don't ever need anything from anyone. And that is not a Christian value. God does not intend for us to be these islands that have no need of anyone else. That actually makes us less human. We need ties that bind. But the Bible's equally clear that we're not to live as dependent and irresponsible people living off the largesse of others because we don't pull our socks up and do our bit. Galatians chapter 6 says, within the space of a few verses, Paul says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And a couple of verses later, he said, each one will have to carry his own load. Isn't that interesting? Each one's going to have to carry his own load, yet we bear one another's burdens. Ephesians chapter 4, let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his hands, so that he may have something to share with those who are in need. Isn't that interesting? What's the motivation for honest work? It's not so you don't have to rely on anyone. It's so that you can form ties of interdependence. And that's, I think, the biblical picture. It's not independence, it's not dependence, it's interdependence. Let's read together a little more of 2 Corinthians. For if the readiness is there to give, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, so that there may be fairness. As it is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. And this takes us into the fourth point, which is that as we learn to do this, then what this does is it shapes us to be people who live in an economy of grace. We learn to live in an economy of grace. And it is a beautiful thing to live in an economy of grace. If all this is God's and I'm stewarding it for him, then there will be many a time where I can give. And there will also be times where I need to receive. And how many of us struggle with that sense of, I don't want to receive a gift because then I feel some sort of obligation to repay, or I feel, and we worry about giving because we thought, and when we realize that this isn't mine and yours, this is all God's, and what we're really doing is moving bits of it around in accordance with our needs, and then it sort of frees you from all of that. Yeah, sometimes you'll have to give to me because I need and you've got some extra, and sometimes I'll have to give to you because the thing will be reversed. And really, we can all get off our ego and our insecurities of all that, because it's not your money or my money anyway. It's God's money first, it's our money second, and it's my responsibility to steward it third. And it is wonderful to start living in to these realities. It's kind of, we're not driven by guilt or the law or these sort of things. We just grow in a sense of easy come, easy go. You know, like Paul says, I'm content in plenty, I'm content in little. The Lord watches over my needs. I do my best to steward this stuff for him, but if I make a mistake, he's there. You know, I live in the economy of grace. I'm part of a family. What we have, we share freely. When we're in need, God will provide. We can just be less anxious and less bothered about all of it. It just matters less what you're paid. It matters less. It matters less what you're paid compared to me. We can let go of all of this. Don't you? Can you not feel attracted by this way of living that Jesus calls us into? You know, what a freedom that is from how money can get a hold in all these ways, our identity, our insecurity. What a relief to live in a different way. Final verses to read from 2 Corinthians. The point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion. No guilt, manipulation, please, etc., etc. God loves a cheerful giver. And God's grace, God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. As it is written, he's distributed freely, he's given to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed for the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. And listen to this verse. You will be enriched in every way to be generous in every way, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. Why does God give us good things? To enable us to give as he gives. Yeah. You are enriched in every way so that you can be generous in every way. So the invitation this morning really is, don't you want to enter into the economy of grace? Don't you want to live in that worldview, way of living, rather than the other ones? Generous people are beautiful people, I think, often, aren't they? Yeah, when you have known really generous people, people who have given, in remarkable ways, often beautiful people, because they just want to see the grace of God released in the lives of others. So they give, giving themselves away for the sake of other people. And I just think that's the way to live, really. So there you go. These are the ways that I think this spiritual discipline shapes us. And it leaves us with the question, really, of who do we want to be? What kind of people do we want to be? Because remember last week, where your treasure is, there your heart will be. There your treasure is, there your heart will be. So in just 5 minutes to finish, I just want to address some practical guidance. This is really for those who may be a bit more newer to faith or that sort of thing. Some of you will have, this won't be switching on many light bulbs for. But I think it's just responsible to finish with a little bit of practical guidance. I hope that implicitly through this week and last week, 2 principles have been landing in you. Just want to make them explicit now to make sure that they do. And the 2 principles I think that really orientate the way that we give are the principle of need. That's the one that shapes how much of God's resources we keep. How much of God's resources do I keep for myself? It has to be related to what I need. And we have talked last week about all the ways we can distort what we need. So all the caveats are there, but we can't escape from that principle. Give us this day our daily bread. It's a prayer for our needs to be met, isn't it? And the principle that shapes how we think about investing God's resources in things that aren't us is radical generosity. That's how Jesus talks, isn't it? Yeah, sell your possessions, give to the poor. You'll have treasure in heaven. Radical generosity. So those principles are there. What should we give to? Well, the New Testament really gives us 3 categories, if you like, of the work of God that our giving generally should be directed to, and they are the poor, ministry, and mission. So there's those sort of mini categories within those, but they're the 3 big ones that the New Testament talks about. And each of those will have its complexities. What is the best way if you see a homeless person on the street? Is it right to give them money, or is it better to help them? Yeah. There's all these complexities about poor and mission and ministry. But what I will say is if you wait until you've worked out the complexities before you start giving, you'll never do it because you won't be motivated to work out the complexities. However, if you've started giving, you'll be motivated to work out the complexities because where your treasure is, there your heart will be. So yes, I'm all up for getting into the complexities, but let's steer a moving ship, shall we, rather than try and make sure we got the sails all right before we raise the anchor. Should most of our giving be done through our local church or not? So really, the answer to this question is, it depends. You need a conversation. You need a culture as a church. So it seems to me right that a substantial part of our giving should be to and through our local church because that's the context where, that's the family we're a part of, and the ministry and mission that we're primarily involved in is kind of there. So it makes sense to me that as we are a family, we should pool God's resources that we've been given to steward together. And as Adrian would say if he were here, it's also really good for us to lose a little bit of our control over how we invest our resources and to kind of pool it as a family. But it's not the case necessarily that all our giving should be to the church. In fact, I think probably the majority of us will have things we want to give to you that aren't the local church as well. And that will depend on our personal circumstances and causes that are close to our heart, things that God calls us into. And that's great. That's part of the diversity of how God moves his resources around. And I think the sort of how you balance all that out, you kind of need a bit of a culture as a church, don't you? Like, if you're part of a local church, that all the money that comes in our common pot, we sort of spend on us, and we don't necessarily give loads away to the poor or whatever, then that's quite different than if you're part of a church that our common money, we actually give a lot of that away to other things. So that's why I say, to some extent, these things depend on the kind of church you're a part of and the decisions that you've made together. John Cook, give us a wave. John Cook, give us a wave at the back. There he is, sitting there at the table. We're really open with our money as a church, and John Cook is the man who can answer all your questions at any point. He's very responsive on email. Or you can email the office, come to our church family meetings, look at the accounts online. We tend to give about 1/3 of our income to things that aren't us, the wider church and poor care and all the rest of it. But John's always up for, we try and have a culture of openness. So perhaps as you're making decisions about what you give here, you might want to know a little bit more about our money and what we do with it. We'd encourage you to have those conversations with John, myself. There's other directors as well who are around. And if you don't know how to get hold of anyone, just email the office and we'll get back to you. Okay, last 2 practical things. How much should we give? What I expect you all to shout back at me is, wrong question, Tim, wrong question. It's not the right question, is it? I'm not going to answer it. The question is not how much should we give. The question is, which of God's resources that we're stewarding are we going to keep for ourselves, and how are we going to use the rest? So change the question. Tim Fellows often says, how much can I give is a much better question than how much should I give. And Tim, actually, Tim grabbed me at the end of last week and he said, some of you don't know Tim Fellows, but he's been a long-standing member of our church family and passionate about this topic. And he grabbed me and said, we've got to make sure we don't just think about income. He's a financial advisor by trade, so, he said, lots of us, our income's what it is, but we also have our assets. And sometimes we think about all this teaching just in relation to our income rather than in relation to our assets as well. So if he was here this morning, he was going to get up and say that, but he's not. So he said, I've got to. So I did. If you're watching, Tim, I've fulfilled your commission. The last thing just to talk about is tithing. So some of us will have been brought up with teaching that we should be giving 10% based on a biblical, supposedly, principle of tithing in the Old Testament. And I could talk more about this, but just to be clear with you, that's not a New Testament Jesus principle. Jesus at no point says that this is how we should manage our money. What he says is the whole lot belongs to God. Unless you're willing to give all of your possessions, you cannot be my disciple. That was Jesus' take on it. And tithing is often a little bit misused anyway, because even in the Old Testament, there wasn't just one 10% tithe. There were several. If you add up all the Old Testament laws on giving, it tends to come to about 25% of your income instead. And anyway, that whole system was based on a way of organizing society where everyone had land to farm. And so a kind of flat giving taxation, if you like, made sense. It just doesn't map over to today. So I would very much encourage you not to take tithing as some sort of, well, if I've done this, I've been faithful in terms of giving. You picked up what I've said over the last 2 weeks. However, having said that, it's not a bad rule of thumb if you're starting and you don't know where to start and you haven't really given seriously before and you don't know what to do. And it's also not a bad rule of thumb if you're ever a bit disorientated in circumstances or stuff's going on or there are complexities and you don't really know. Sometimes saying, you know what, I'm going to do 10% while I get through this period of life or work out whatever, I think that can be useful for many Christians to say, I'm starting to give, boom, or I need to work through this, boom. But just let's not take that as the final word on giving. It's perhaps the first word for some of us occasionally. That's as generous as I can be to tithing, really. So there you go. Personally, I do. Oh, yeah, that's fine. I would say me and my wife have used it personally as that kind of, at times where we don't know what's going on, sometimes we've just gone there until things have become clearer. So I have, despite what I've got to say about tithing, I have occasionally used it to help. So there you go. That's it for today. 2 challenges to leave you with today. The first one is a reflective one. The second one is a practical one. So the first challenge is really, who do you want to be? Go and reflect on that. What sort of person would you like to be? And how will the way that you use money make you that sort of person? Where your treasure is, there your heart will be. So don't go and make changes based on law or guilt or condemnation or any of that. Go and make your decisions based on the kind of person you want to be and the kind of way you want to live. And then the second challenge is, what might be your next step in the spiritual discipline of giving? Greg, the pastor at Chorn, he said that he preached a sermon on this where he said, sometimes you start with a fiver. You haven't given anything, you start with a fiver. And then if you've been doing a fiver for a while, you become a tither because it rhymes. And then when you've been doing that for a while, you get in touch with Jesus' kind of desire that all this stuff comes under God's rule and reign. So again, not a bad idea. If you don't give at all, just start with something somewhere. Get going. And if you do, now's the time to review that and sit there with Lord, do your budget, see where your money goes. Who do I want to become? And maybe make some changes and enjoy living evermore in the economy of grace.